For some reason, I have small trains on my mind. Well, are you looking for a crazy hat idea or just looking for the way to draw the most possible attention to yourself at a train show? Well, try running a train around your head. This is a small T-gauge train that I put onto a hat, and because T-gauge trains have magnets on them, they stay on the track really, really well. So you can move your head around and the train won't actually fall off. So kind of a fun thing to wear around. I built this to wear around train shows. Maybe I'll wear it around on Halloween, something like that. But anyway, it's kind of a fun little project and something you can also just keep on the side of your desk as well as a nice little display. And as I mentioned in a previous video, the inspiration for this layout came from a video I saw from Simone Yetch, who also built a train on a hat. Although hers was more of a true hat than mine is, nonetheless, it gave me the idea to build this layout. So anyway, here's a closer look at this little T-gauge layout here I have on my hat. I do have a little tunnel in the backside here that I thought was kind of fun. Anyway, I have this removable top section here. Here is where the battery-powered T-gauge controller sits. There's a little hole on here, and that keys into this control knob, and then there's some Velcro to help hold it on. This way you can set your speed, turn it on, direction, all that, and then cover it up so it looks a little bit nicer when you're operating it. But overall, it works pretty well. So let's look at how I built this little layout. Okay, so let's go through the steps of actually building this little hat layout. So I found a hat in my closet that was about the right size to fit a loop of T-gauge track, and I used that for the actual base of the hat as well as a guide for cutting all the foam pieces. So I laid the hat on a piece of foam, traced around it, and then I used a bendable ruler as well as a metal guide to help kind of guide my knife as I was cutting around it. I could have used a hot wire cutter, but I decided I wouldn't be able to actually keep the curve as smooth since it wasn't a consistent radius all the way around. The next step was to cut a hole in that first layer of foam that was going to be big enough to fit around my head. So again, I just used the hat as a guide, cut that hole out so the interior part of the hat would fit inside of it. And of course I needed to build that up, and so I got a 2-inch thick layer of foam. I cut it to size for the exterior, and then I cut a hole through the middle of it to again fit around my head and fit around the interior part of the hat. And once I finished cutting that piece out, I glued it to the bottom base of the hat and then took a 1/2-inch piece of foam and glued that on as well, and that basically served as a part that would rest against my head and serve as the base for the controller. And then the next layer of foam was actually the interior of that first 2-inch piece of foam that I cut out. So I stacked that on top and then cut a hole out for the actual battery controller itself that was just the right size to keep it snugly in place. The last step was to add another layer of foam to the base because I didn't want my track to be flush with the ground all the way around, but rather have a bridge in one spot. So I needed to raise it up so I could have that bridge. So I cut pieces of 1/2-inch foam to raise up the track a little bit more and allow for me to have a bridge in the front of the layout. I also built up some areas in the back to eventually serve as a tunnel. So with all the foam construction done, I just took the hat, took some tacky glue, put a bunch of tacky glue on the hat, and then stuck that into the foam base, and then trimmed all the foam bits here and there to make it as smooth as I could all the way around and get the overall shape roughly like I wanted it. I did carve a bunch of score marks into the areas of the main central mountain area, and that was just to provide a little bit of tooth. So when I put the Sculptamold on top, it would have something to kind of bind into because I did want to keep that layer of Sculptamold pretty thin so it wouldn't get too heavy on my head. So once that was done, I mixed up my Sculptamold and just spread that all over the entire mountain area of the layout as well as the back tunnel area. I ended up needing to use 2 small batches, but eventually I got everything covered nicely and then just set that aside to dry. I actually put it outside in the sun so it would dry pretty fast, so I was able to come back the next day and do the painting. And so I painted everything using some paint washes. I took some brown paint and water, about 1/3 paint, 2/3 water, maybe even a little bit more than that in terms of water, and mixed that up, and then just spread that on top of the foam and Sculptamold scenery. You want to use washes and not just straight paint because this gives you variation in color texture because the amount of paint that absorbs into the Sculptamold will vary depending on how heavy the paint was put on in that spot, and so you get a lot of color variation so it looks a lot more realistic. If you just paint everything on, you're going to get a pretty uniform brown color, that won't look as realistic. So then once that brown paint was on, I mixed up a wash of gray paint and did the same thing, applying that wash of gray paint. And then once that was dry, I followed that up with a wash of black paint to kind of help accentuate all the little nooks and cavities in the Sculptamold, and apply, again, a third layer of color in there to help it look a little bit more realistic. And finally, came back with a light gray again and just dry brushed highlights onto the layout. So I got almost all the paint off the brush, and that's very gently swept the brush across the Sculptamold rocks to highlight just those top areas with light gray paint. And that kind of gave the effect of sunlight hitting it and accentuated all the little areas sticking out farther. So that really added a fourth layer of color and texture to the rocks and really kind of helped bring them a little bit more to life. At that point, I decided it was a good time to get the simple wiring for this project completed, so I drilled a hole from the top of the hat down into the middle open area, and then drilled a hole from the side where I wanted the wires to connect from the track into the middle area as well. And then I tried to fish the wires through that hole in the side, but I had to cut a hole in the hat itself so I could grab the wires out of the one hole and then fish them into the other hole that went up into the top of the layout where the controller was going to sit, so I would be able to plug those wires in. So with that done, it was time to put the track back on the layout and figure out my little bridge area. So I just took scrap pieces of styrene that I had. This was actually part of a roof from a Walthers kit that I didn't need, and so I used that as the underside of my bridge, and I just cut that out to fit the track radius in that area. I needed supports for the bridge, and so I found some pieces of a smokestack in one of the kits as well that I didn't need, and then I just cut those to size so I could glue them to the bottom of my bridge. I needed sides, so I basically found some pieces of 90-degree angle styrene strip that I had in my box of styrene scrap bits, and I glued those to the side of the bridge, and then I glued another piece of styrene strip on top of that to add a little bit more elevation to the side of the bridge, and I called that good enough. So then I glued everything together, glued on the legs, made sure everything fit well, and then all I did was cover it with a layer of gray paint, and I called it good. So to actually glue the track down, I just used tacky glue once again, put a bead of tacky glue around the layout, pressed the track into that, and just added some weights to make sure it would bond very well to the layout. Next up, it was time to ballast the track. And now T-gauge track is really small, so trying to use N-scale ballast just wasn't going to work. So I was trying to figure out what the best way would be to ballast this very small track. And so what I came up with was to use tile grout. And so we had remodeled our house last year, and I had a lot of leftover grout from the various tile projects we did. And I found a color that was this pewter color that I thought would look pretty good for this little layout project. And so I poured some into a cup and basically applied it like I would any other ballast, pouring it on, smoothing it out with a brush, and then spraying it down with some alcohol, and then eventually soaking it with a diluted mix of matte medium. And technically, since it is grout, you could just spray it down and it would harden by itself, since it already has the binders built into it. But because it was a very thin layer on the track, it potentially might crack off easily over time, so I still felt it was a good idea to soak it with that glue mix as well, just to add a little bit more strength. I also at that time added a dirt and rock mix along the base of the cliffs all the way around the layout, so when I soaked everything with glue I could attach both that and the ballast at the same time. Overall, I think everything turned out really well like this, and I actually almost kept it as a desert theme instead of adding more trees, because I did like the look of just the rock and the cliff and the ballast as it was. So at this point, it was time to start doing some of the fun scenery work. So I painted glue where I wanted to have the scenery materials attached, and then sprinkled on layers of ground foam all around the layout in those areas using 3 or 4 different shades of ground foam. And then again, spraying everything down with some alcohol and soaking it with some diluted matte medium to help really secure it in place. Next, I started working on the hat lid. So I did the same thing, covering everything with ground foam, and then I used little bits of Woodland Scenics clump foliage to model the trees on top of that lid. And the actual clump foliage bits themselves are pretty small, but they weren't really small enough, and so I basically tore each of those into 2 or 3 pieces, and then I applied those to that piece of foam so it would kind of give the right scale of texture for those trees. I got everything covered with a good layer of the foam and soaked it with a diluted mix of matte medium and set that aside to dry. This wasn't going to be enough foam on there, but I couldn't do it all at one time because, again, it did have a rounded shape, and so at some point foam would start rolling off. And so I needed to basically get that first layer glued down and then come back and do a second and third layer of ground foam and foliage to kind of build everything up and get full coverage on that rounded shape. Then I did the same thing with the actual layout itself, taking little bits of clump foliage and gluing them onto the layout, basically painting glue on the layout first, attaching all the bits of clump foliage, and then I just worked my way around the layout, adding the little tiny bits of clump foliage everywhere that I thought it would look appropriate, including a ring around the top. And then to add more texture, I took some light green fine leaf foliage from Woodland Scenics and tore off little tiny bits and stuck those into the foam everywhere. So I didn't really use that much material, but I covered the entire layout with little bits of that fine leaf foliage embedded into the clump foliage that was already in place. And I've used this technique before, and it works really well because the clump foliage basically provides it a way to support itself. You know, when you're using little pieces like this, you're not trying to drill little tiny holes for each piece of fine leaf foliage, and they're less likely to break off because they do have that soft, cushy foam underneath it, so that does help provide a little bit of support as well. And it ends up working pretty well. You basically are creating the illusion of extra texture there, and the combination of that clump foliage and the fine leaf foliage kind of embedded in there does make it look really nice, I think, in terms of providing the right scale of texture that you want to look like a forest. And so once I had all that in place, I just went through, again, soaked everything with alcohol and a diluted mix of matte medium to make sure everything was securely attached. Next, it was time to paint those bottom sides, basically the brim of the hat all the way around. So I mixed up some brown and gray paint, painted that on there, and then I actually just added a bunch of glue in there as well and painted that on there to basically serve as a colored glue mix on that part of the layout. And then I just took a mix of ground foam again, pretty much what I used elsewhere in the layout. It's different earth shades and greens that I have in different bags in my supply of ground foam. Mixed a bunch together and then just sprinkled that onto that glue and paint mix all around the brim of the layout until I had everything well covered. And then I basically just went through and soaked everything with that diluted mix of matte medium once again, because I really wanted this to be very securely attached, being a hat that would get worn around, and I didn't want to have it kind of wear off over time very easily. So the last thing to do was to work on the waterfall. So I used a gloss gel medium, applied a little bit of this turquoise blue color to give it a little bit of color so it wouldn't just be totally clear, and then applied that to the layout using a brush. And I had to do this in a couple of different layers to build it up over time to get everything fully covered so it looked like actual deeper layers of water. Now for the last batch of gel medium, I actually applied some of that snowflake material and applied that to the layout and actually added a little bit of white paint in there as well to make it look really frothy and foamy. And that ended up being a little bit over the top. It worked okay for the waterfall, but overall, if I hadn't put that white paint in there, I think it would have looked a lot better in the end. But, you know, it looks okay for now. But anyway, I think improving the waterfall will be another project I'll try to work on in terms of painting it to look a little bit more realistic. But for now, it's okay. And I didn't have time to do any additional work on it before getting this video out. But anyway, that was pretty much it for building this hat. So anyway, this was a very fun project to do. It didn't take very long. I did the whole thing on and off in about 2 weeks, so a pretty quick build and definitely a fun project and kind of a fun thing to just wear around. Obviously, it's not something you're going to want to wear around that much, but you know, walking around a train show, maybe walking around on Halloween, trick-or-treating, that kind of thing, you know, there's an idea. So if you haven't looked at T-gauge trains before, this might be a reason to do it. So hopefully a few more of you get some crazy ideas of what you could do with these little trains. And so hopefully it was a fun video for you, but that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.